Hello, my friend. Tonight's story is woven from soft shadows and gentle mystery perfect for guiding your thoughts away from the noise of the day. You're invited to travel back in time to a quiet corner of old Prague where legends still breathe, and even the ticking of a clock can hold ancient secrets. So take a deep breath. Let your eyes grow heavy. You're in a safe place. Let the sound of my voice lead you gently into the unfolding night. You do not need to remember all the details. Just listen and let yourself drift with the rhythm of this tale. Before we begin, if you enjoy these soothing bedtime stories and would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to the channel and tapping the little bell so you never miss a story. Your support means the world and helps keep this space quiet and calm for everyone. The rain in Prague did not fall so much as whisper. It misted down in tiny silken threads, catching the amber light of the gas lamps along the cobbled streets of Stare Mesto, the old town. The scent of damp stone and roasted chestnuts drifted through the alleys, carried on a breeze soft as a sigh. A solitary figure stepped from a dark green tram as it hissed to a stop by the town square. Her name was Elena Martel, and she had come from the quiet countryside of Moravia, leaving behind winding vineyards and sleepy hills. She was not one for big cities, but this wasn't just a city. This was Prague, a place older than many remembered, full of alleys that twisted like questions and buildings that leaned in to listen. Elena had rented a small flat on Tenska Street, a modest walk from the Astronomical Clock. That clock horloge, as the locals called it, was the reason she had come. She was a historian, quiet and thoughtful, who had spent years poring over dusty volumes and crumbling parchment. But the horloge had always fascinated her. Built in 1410, its face was more than time and stars. It was a map of heaven and earth, a riddle in metal and wood. They said it had a heart. They said it still beat. She pulled her coat tighter around her as she stepped toward her building. The key clinked against the lock, and with a creak, the door gave way to a hallway that smelled faintly of beeswax and cinnamon. Her flat was on the third floor, small, quiet, and just what she needed. From her window, she could see the outline of the old town square and the shadowed spires of the Church of Our Lady before 10. Elena set her suitcase down and lit a candle. Even though she had electric lights, she liked the flicker. It made things feel slower, softer. She poured herself a cup of chamomile tea, steam curling in tendrils above the cup, and sat by the window. That's when she heard it. Tick, tick. The sound was impossibly faint, barely audible above the drizzle tapping at the glass. But it was there, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. It didn't come from her watch or any nearby clock. It came from beyond her flat, echoing as if from the very walls of the city itself. She closed her eyes. It had begun. The next morning, Elena set out early with her scarf pulled high around her neck and her notebook in her satchel. The air still held the chill of rain, and the streets sparkled faintly in the morning sun. She made her way to the archives beneath the Clementinum Library, a Baroque masterpiece that smelled of ink and ghosts. It was here that the private letters of Ludwig Krause, the last known master of the astronomical clock, were kept, rarely requested, often forgotten. A small, stooped librarian named Pavel brought her the box, wrapped in cotton and sealed with wax, so old it had cracked. Elena opened it with reverence. The letters were beautiful, written in looping ink with the kind of care people once gave to words. Most were mundane. Repairs requested, hours logged, occasional complaints about pigeons. But one letter, one worn envelope, with the edge singed, stood out. Asterisk, to he who hears the clock whisper. Asterisk, the gears turn not by hand, but by pact. The price was time, and we paid it gladly. But now it turns against us. If you are reading this, it has chosen again. Do not let it see your fear. Asterisk, L. K. Rasa Elena's breath caught. It wasn't just a clock. It was something alive. That night, the ticking was louder. Not enough to disturb the neighbors, perhaps, but loud enough that Elena awoke with the sound etched into her dreams. She sat up, eyes wide in the glow of the moonlight pouring through the window. She slipped on her robe and followed the sound. Her building was old, wooden floors softened by time. The ticking drew her upward, toward the attic space she hadn't explored. The door was stiff, but it opened, revealing a low-ceilinged room full of dust motes and forgotten trunks. In the center stood a velvet-covered table, and on that table a clock. But it wasn't the horloge. This was a miniature, an ornate brass replica, etched in symbols and tiny dials that turned of their own accord. Elena reached out. Her fingers hovered. Tick, tick. She touched the frame, and the world exhaled. She was no longer in the attic. She was standing in the middle of the old town square, but the air was different. The people wore robes and feathered hats. A boy pushed a cart full of herbs. A woman sang in Latin. She looked up. The horloge loomed above her, not silent, but ringing with clear, bell-like notes that shimmered in the air. Beside her stood a man in green robes. "You touched the heart," he said, not unkindly. "I? What is this?" "A memory. The clock remembers." Elena blinked, confused. "Why me?" "Because you listen, and because the pact is broken." The world spun again gently, like a music box slowing to stillness. Back in the attic, the velvet clock had gone still. Elena sat down, heart steady, thoughts cloudy but calm. The ticking had faded, but the memory lingered. She knew now this was more than research. The horloge was a machine built not only for timekeeping, but for something deeper, a balance, an agreement with time itself. And something had changed. She would return to the square tomorrow. She would stand before the great clock and listen not with ears, but with presence. For the haunted clock of Prague had a story to tell, and she was ready to hear it. The morning light poured gently into the alleys of Prague like warm milk over cobblestones, softening the angles and edges of the waking city. Elena wrapped herself in a warm wool coat, the edges still carrying the scent of old cedar from the attic trunk she had discovered the night before. The strange clock, the velvet-covered replica, remained in the attic, its ticking now silent, yet still echoing in the recesses of her thoughts. She hadn't slept much, and yet she did not feel tired. Something within her had settled. There was a quiet certainty, like a book finding its place on a shelf. Today, she would return to the astronomical clock not as a visitor, not as a historian, but as something in between, a listener. As she stepped into the square, the morning mist swirled in thin ribbons along the cobbled stones. The tourists hadn't yet gathered, and the city had that rarest of qualities, a moment to itself. The horloge loomed above, its golden astrolabe and Roman numerals catching slivers of early sunlight. The apostles hadn't made their hourly procession yet, and the statue of death still stood in silence, holding his hourglass like a lullaby waiting to be turned. Elena approached slowly, standing directly beneath the clock. She closed her eyes and listened. No sound. And then faintly, the same whisper she had heard in the attic. Not words. Not a voice, but a rhythm. It wasn't coming from the gears or the dials. It was coming from the stone itself, as if the wall were breathing in slow, ancient intervals. That afternoon, she returned to the Clementinum. The archivist, Pavel, had taken a quiet liking to her and nodded when she asked about anything related to Ludwig Krossa's later years. Pavel disappeared into the back shelves and returned with a slim folio of sketches and notes bound with leather string. Elena flipped through the pages slowly. There were drawings of mechanisms, musings on celestial cycles, annotations in a mix of Latin and Czech. And then she found it, a page titled simply Zvonog, the bell-maker. The sketch was of a small, forgotten room behind the clock face. In it stood an elderly man, curved like a hook, hammering a bell with silver gloves. Beneath the drawing were 3 words. Asterisk, he listens backward. Elena stared at the phrase. It made no logical sense. And yet, it did. She ran her fingers over the ink, letting the words settle. She needed to find this room. She needed to meet the bellmaker. That evening, after the square had emptied, and the vendors had packed away their carts of marionettes and candied almonds, Elena stood once again beneath the horloge. Her breath puffed in the cool night air, mingling with the scent of aged stone and something metallic like old coins or worn brass. She searched the facade quietly, her gloved hand tracing centuries-old grooves and carvings. Then, beneath the statue of the philosopher, just beneath the hem of his cloak, her fingers brushed something smooth and cold. A key, brass, slightly curved, engraved with the outline of a bell. She turned it in her palm. It was heavier than expected, and warm, as if it had been waiting. Elena didn't hesitate. She circled the clock tower and found the old service door, long forgotten by most. With a steady breath, she slipped the key into the lock and turned. The door opened with a sigh, revealing a narrow spiral staircase, lit only by slivers of moonlight slipping through the stone slats in the tower. She climbed, slowly. The sound of her steps echoed faintly, like raindrops on tin. At the top, another door. This one wasn't locked. She pushed it open. The room beyond was small and round, fitted into the topmost curve of the tower. Dust hung thick in the air, catching the silver moonlight that poured through the wide arched windows. Tools lined the walls, antique, handmade, and meticulously arranged. And at the center stood a bell, not large no more than the size of a small cauldron, but polished to a mirror sheen, its surface etched with stars, moons, and unfamiliar runes. Behind the bell, hunched on a stool, sat a man. He wore a long, moss-green coat, and silver gloves covered his hands. His hair was white and thin, and his face was lined not just with age, but with memory. Without turning, he spoke. "You opened the memory clock." Elena froze. Yes, I found it in the attic." He turned then, his eyes a cloudy gray. "You're the first to hear it in over 100 years. Time is changing its mind again." "I don't understand," she said softly, the hush of the room making even whispers sound loud. "You will," he replied. "But first you must listen. Backward." The bellmaker's name, he said, was Tomek. He had once been the apprentice of Ludwig Krause, and had remained long after his master vanished into rumor and legend. His task had always been the same, to tune the smaller bells within the horloge not for chimes, but for echoes. "The clock doesn't just keep time," Tomek said. "It absorbs it, stores the hours past, like a shell holding the sound of the sea. And sometimes, if you listen the right way, you can hear what once was." He lifted a velvet mallet and struck the bell. It rang not loud, not shrill, but deep and warm, like the first drop of rain on autumn leaves. And then a voice, faint, female, laughing. Elena blinked. Who was that? "My sister," Tomek whispered. "She was lost to time. But the bell remembers her." Elena stepped closer. The runes on the bell glowed faintly in the moonlight, as if stirred by memory. "Can the clock show the past?" she asked. Tomek nodded. "It can, but it must be asked gently." That night, back in her flat, Elena lit 3 candles and opened the miniature clock from the attic. Its face was still, the hands locked in a position that had no meaning. 12 past 7, or perhaps 1 before 8. She whispered, "Show me the truth." And the hands moved, slowly, carefully, until they stopped again at midnight. The clock ticked once, and Elena was no longer in her room. She stood in the horloge tower, but it was daytime, and the streets below, bustled with people in clothes from another era. She watched as Ludwig Krause knelt before the great clock, his hands on the gears, his eyes wet with tears. "He'll ask for more," he muttered. "The clock wants more." Behind him, Tamak as a young man called, "Master, we cannot give it what it asks." But Ludwig did not answer. He pulled a lever. The clock groaned, and time shifted. The morning after her vision, Elena lay still for a long while in bed, wrapped beneath a knitted gray blanket passed down through her family. The city beyond her windows stirred softly tram bells, footsteps over wet cobblestones, and the low bark of a distant dog. But in her room, all was still. She wasn't afraid. Even as the image of Ludwig Krause haunted her thoughts, even as the echo of that groaning gear from the vision rang faintly in her ears, there was a stillness in her soul, a peaceful knowing that she was following something real, something buried and patient. She dressed slowly, made a cup of warm lavender tea, and lit a small beeswax candle by her windowsill. It was an old tradition from her childhood, meant to guide wandering spirits home. Perhaps it would also guide the truth. That afternoon, Elena returned to Tomek's workshop at the top of the horloge tower. The old man greeted her with the same serene calm as before, seated once again before the silver-burnished bell. "I saw them," she said gently, lowering herself onto the wooden stool beside him. "I saw your master. I saw you." He smiled faintly, though it carried the weight of many winters. "The clock remembers all it's been given, even the pain. What happened that day?" she asked. Tomek leaned back, his eyes turning inward. Ludwig believed the clock was more than a machine. He thought it could preserve not only hours, but moments' memories. That it could hold time in suspension, like amber holds ancient insects. Elena said nothing. She felt that if she spoke, the truth might slip away like mist. "He made a deal," Tomek continued. "Not with a man or spirit, but with time itself. He sacrificed something." "What?" "An hour." Elena frowned. "An hour?" He nodded slowly. "There is 1 hour each year, just one that vanishes from the city. No one remembers it. No one experiences it. A hidden moment, locked away. The lost hour," she whispered. Tomek's voice was gentle. "It's still somewhere inside the clock." With Tomek's guidance, Elena found herself once again spiraling up the tower. But this time, he handed her something before she left. A small brass pendant shaped like a keyhole. "Hold this when you reach the apex," he instructed, "and do not speak until the chimes stop." The climb was steeper than she remembered. The stones underfoot felt older somehow, more brittle. And yet, the air grew lighter as she ascended, as though time itself were thinner here. At the top of the tower, beyond the workshop and the wheel of gears, was a narrow door she hadn't noticed before. It had no handle, just a smooth brass plate at its center, curved like a crescent moon. She pressed the pendant against the plate. There was a soft sound like a deep breath, and the door opened. Inside, the room was round and empty. Not in the way that a room lacks furniture, but in the way a breath can hold a pause. Elena stepped inside. The door closed behind her. No light, no sound. And then, a slow chiming began. 1, 2, 3, 12. Silence. And with that silence, light. But it was not sunlight. It was golden, diffuse, as if coming from the very air. Before her stood a staircase, made not of wood or stone, but of shimmering threads. Time itself, woven into form. She stepped onto it. At the top of the impossible staircase, Elena found a room unlike any she had ever seen. There were no walls, only floating shelves of glowing, translucent books. The ceiling arched forever upward, filled with moving constellations that shifted gently like lullabies in the sky. At the center of the room was a figure, tall, androgynous, robed in smoke and starlight. Their face shimmered with shifting features, not quite male or female, just presence. You have come to the library of the hour lost, the figure said, their voice like rain on glass. I didn't mean to, Elena said quietly, heart soft in her chest. None ever do. Time chooses its listeners. Are you time? She asked. The figure shook their head. I am its librarian. They gestured, and a floating book descended from above. Its cover shimmered with the outline of the horloge. This is the moment you seek. Elena opened it. The pages felt warm beneath her fingers. And on the parchment, words began to form. A journal entry. Ludwig's handwriting. Asterisk, I have given it my hour. My sister's last memory now lives inside the clock. It is safe here, but I have begun to forget her face. The cost was more than time. Tears pricked Elena's eyes. The lost hour was more than a mystery. It was a vault of grief. The librarian watched as Elena closed the book, her fingers trembling slightly. She was his sister, she murmured, the laughter in the bell. That's who I heard. Her name, the librarian said, has been forgotten by the waking world, but not by the clock. Elena whispered, Can I return it? You may try, but memory is delicate. You must find her name within the hour itself. How? The librarian smiled faintly. Not all books are written in ink. With that, the room began to dim. The stars above shimmered and turned inward, pulling her gently downward, like a tide guiding her back to shore. She awoke in her own bed, though the pendant lay warm against her skin, and the scent of starlight still lingered in the air. Elena knew what she had to do. The next day, she returned to the attic not of her flat, but of the old municipal hall adjoining the horloge tower. She had to bribe the janitor with tea and pastries, but eventually he allowed her in. Dust coated every surface, but in the far corner stood an old trunk sealed with leather straps. Inside, among rusted tools and brittle blueprints, she found it, a painting wrapped in linen and tied with string. She unwrapped it carefully. A girl, no more than 20. Chestnut hair, a green velvet ribbon, eyes full of light, laughter captured in oil. The back of the canvas bore a name. Lenka Krasa, minus 1402. She closed her eyes. The name drifted through her like music, returning to a long, silent room. Lenka. The clock's lost hour had a name again. And with it, perhaps, a way home. Rain softened the rooftops of Prague that evening, casting the city in a gentle hush. Water dripped in slow, steady rhythms from balconies and lanterns. The world felt slowed, cradled in velvet shadow. Elena walked quietly through the old town square, her hands tucked in her pockets, the name still echoing gently in her mind. Lenka Krasa. A name once lost to time, a name now found. She thought of the portrait, those laughing green eyes, the ribbon in her hair, and how it had been tucked away for centuries, hidden beneath the layers of memory and dust. The hour had a name now, and perhaps, just perhaps, the clock had waited for this moment. When she reached the tower, the service door accepted the brass key again, as though it too had been expecting her. The spiral staircase welcomed her feet without protest. Everything inside the tower, the walls, the gears, the silence felt alert, like a cat listening in the dark. And when she arrived at the bellmaker's room, Tomek was already waiting. You found her, he said softly, rising to his feet. I did, Elena whispered. Lenka, that was her name. He nodded, a deep exhale leaving his chest. It's time then. The clock must remember. Tomek retrieved a small case from beneath his workbench, polished mahogany with latches of brushed copper. When he opened it, nestled inside was a single item, a silver tuning fork etched with the same stars and runes that adorned the memory bell. This, he said, was forged from the same metal as the horloge's core. It carries the resonance of the original hour. He handed it to Elena. It must be struck once, beneath the central gear, and only when the clock strikes midnight. A vibration will awaken the hour. If Lenka's name is spoken into the stillness, it may return. Elena looked down at the delicate instrument. It hummed faintly even in her palm, like a creature breathing. What happens if it returns? She asked. Tomek smiled, sad and gentle. Then Ludwig may rest. And perhaps so may the clock. She nodded, the weight of time settling on her shoulders. The silence between the gears awaited her. The central gear was deep within the horloge, accessible only through a narrow crawl space behind the old figures of the apostles. Elena followed Tomek's instructions precisely, feeling each rung of the iron ladder as though it were part of a ritual. The passage grew tighter the deeper she went, the sound of the world above fading like a lullaby ending. At last, she emerged into a chamber unseen by tourists or caretakers. This was the clock's true heart. The massive gear stood in the center, as wide as the room itself, its teeth glinting faintly in the light of her lantern. The room smelled of metal, oil, and something older, something like memory turned physical. She crouched beside the base and waited. The clock ticked onward, slow and heavy. She could feel it in her bones. When the chimes began, each one struck like a wave. 1, 2, 3, up to 12. The world held its breath, and she struck the fork. The sound that followed wasn't sharp. It wasn't loud. It was warm. Like a violin string plucked in the stillness, the tuning fork's vibration slipped through the chamber, climbing over the gears and down into the stone. And then the clock responded. The central gear slowed. Not stopped, just slowed, as if allowing something to catch up. And in the sudden stillness, the room shifted. Colors dimmed. Shadows moved. And Elena heard it, laughter. A girl's laughter, soft and full of sunlight. The air shimmered, and a vision bloomed in the center of the chamber, like a memory unfurling. Lenka. She danced barefoot along the square, ribbon fluttering behind her, as her brother watched from the steps of the tower. He held a small brass timepiece and called her name. Lenka! She turned and smiled, and the world froze. Elena stepped forward, heart full, voice steady. Lenka Krasa, she whispered. The vision did not flicker. Instead, it bowed. Lenka turned, her face serene, and she stepped gently toward the brass gear. As she moved, the ribbon in her hair unwound, floating behind her like a river of silk. It passed through the gear, just once, and then the gear began to turn again. Faster, smoother, with a new rhythm. The clock had accepted the name. The hour was returning, and the girl faded into the golden air. Elena closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." When Elena emerged from the crawl space, dawn was just brushing the rooftops. Tomek stood by the window, watching the horizon soften into pale rose and silver. "Well?" he asked. "She returned," Elena said, voice thick with emotion. Her name was enough. He bowed his head. "Then the pact is restored." "What happens now?" Tomek took a deep breath, the first she'd seen him take that didn't carry the weight of sorrow. "The lost hour will appear again. Not every year, but sometimes. When the city needs to remember something important." Elena smiled faintly. "And you?" He shrugged. "I listen. That's what I do." She nodded, then paused. "I think I'll stay a while, if that's all right." Tomek looked at her with a smile older than the bells. "I'd be grateful." The days that followed were quiet, not in a lifeless sense, but in the way deep snow hushes a forest blanketing it, softening sound and edge alike. Elena remained in the tower. Her flat on Tenska Street became a place she visited only to rest, and even then, she often found herself rising in the middle of the night and returning to the bellmaker's room. There was something magnetic about the space now, as if the very air welcomed her, a gentle pull from a world just outside the one she knew. Tomek continued his gentle work, polishing, tuning, listening. He said little, but Elena felt the way the rhythm of the horloge had shifted. The gears no longer groaned in protest, and the chimes carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. Something deep and old had been eased, like a knot in the fabric of time slowly unraveling. But even in peace, mystery lingered, and Elena began to dream. At first, the dreams were fragments. She would find herself wandering the narrow alleys of Old Town, but the signs were in languages she didn't recognize. She would pass under archways that didn't exist in the present city, or hear voices reciting poetry she'd never read. Then came the dream of the mirror. She stood before the Olois at twilight. The square was empty, the windows of the surrounding buildings unlit. The clock's hands spun backward, slow and deliberate, and in the glass beneath the dial, she saw not her own reflection, but someone else's. A woman with her face, but older. Eyes the same gray-green, but surrounded by lines that whispered of years spent in quiet study and patient waiting. The figure raised one hand and placed it on the glass, and Elena, in her dream, reached out and touched it too. When she awoke, the sensation remained. A faint warmth on her fingertips, and a quiet certainty that the clock had shown her something not of the past, but of the future. She returned to Tomuk that afternoon, rain misting across the city like threads of silk. "I think the clock is trying to show me something else," she said, seated cross-legged on the rug in his room. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted the alignment of a tuning chime, then wiped his hands on a cloth. "It always shows more than it asks for," he said softly. "I saw a woman. She looked like me, older." Tomuk nodded. Time folds inward sometimes, especially when peace returns. The veil between hours grows thin. What does that mean? He walked to a shelf and pulled down a book she hadn't seen before. It was bound in deep green leather and bore no title. This was Ludwig's final journal. "I kept it after he vanished." She opened the cover gently. The first page bore a single sentence. Asterisk, some doors only open once the clock forgives. The journal detailed a room hidden deeper than even the gear chamber, a room Ludwig called the Veil Room. It was said to exist only during certain alignments of time, appearing when the horloges reached perfect balance between the past and the possible. That night, Elena waited until the clock struck 3. The city was asleep. Even the square below had quieted, its usual echo of footsteps and distant laughter gone. She entered the tower with a lantern and Tomek's blessing. Past the crawl space, beyond the central gear, there was a small alcove she had never noticed. The bricks surrounding it looked untouched by time, no soot, no dust, as though the room behind it breathed clean air. She stepped closer, and without touching anything, the bricks shimmered, faded, and revealed an open archway. She stepped through. The chamber was round and domed, with walls of smoky quartz that reflected her image not once, but endlessly. The floor was smooth, carved from one single stone, and in the center stood an hourglass taller than a person. Its sand moved slowly upward, and beside it, a book floated in mid-air, open to a blank page. As Elena approached, the sand inside the hourglass paused. She reached out, and the book's page began to fill with ink, not written by her, but by something unseen. Words appeared, in careful script. Asterisk, you have given the name. The memory is returned, but one question still turns. Who winds the clock when the keepers are gone? Asterisk, Elena's breath caught. The gears didn't move forever on their own. Someone, something, had to keep the balance. And maybe the clock had chosen her. When she left the veil room, the archway vanished behind her. Back in the main chamber, Tomek was waiting. "You saw it," he said, not as a question. She nodded slowly. "It asked me who winds the clock when the keepers are gone." Tomek stepped closer and placed something in her hand. It was small, circular, and cold an ornate key, etched with constellations. The clock chooses its next keeper, not by bloodline or title, but by harmony. But I'm not an engineer, she said, voice quiet. No, but you listened. You asked the right questions. You didn't take, you offered. Elena looked down at the key. What do I do with it? You don't wind it with hands, Tomek said. You wind it with memory. And in that moment, the clock chimed again. Not 12, not 1, but 13. And the city did not stir, because this was not a waking hour. It was the hidden one, and Elena was now its keeper. The chime echoed long after its sound had faded, humming through the stone and rafters of the tower, threading its way into the city's bones. The 13th chime impossible, unrecorded, and unheard by anyone but Elena. Outside, Prague remained unchanged. The trams rolled along their tracks. Rain puddled on the cobblestones. Candles flickered behind frosted windows. And yet, something felt different. It wasn't the silence, nor the light, nor the temperature. It was a stillness within Elena herself, as though, after all the unraveling, she had at last stepped into alignment with something greater. The key in her hand pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and she knew without instruction, without map or manual, that the horloge had begun a new cycle, a cycle with her at its center. She was not afraid. She was ready. Tomek led her into the uppermost chamber of the tower, a place few had ever seen. Even he rarely came here. The ceiling curved like the inside of a bell, and in the center stood a great table of obsidian, its surface polished to glass. Etched across the table were intricate lines, symbols, and constellations. Not a map of stars, but a map of hours. These are the 24 known hours, Tomek explained. Each one holds meaning, memory, motion. And the 13th? Elena asked, her fingers hovering just above the center of the map. There is no place for it here, he said, because it is not meant to stay. She frowned gently. Then why reveal it to me? Tomek gave a quiet smile. Because sometimes the clock needs a new note in its song, something unscheduled, something human. And suddenly Elena understood. The 13th chime wasn't a disruption. It was a gift, a breath in the flow, a space between measures of music where the silence held more truth than sound. That evening, while the city dined and drifted into its warm-lit night, Elena stood again before the miniature velvet-covered clock in her attic. She had not touched it since the day it had led her into memory. But now, under the gentle gaze of candlelight, she lifted the lid and placed the key into the small port on its base. The clock didn't tick. It whispered. And with a soft click, a hidden drawer slid open from the side. Inside lay a folded letter, ink faded to the shade of fog. She unfolded it with reverence. To the next keeper, asterisk, if you have found this, then you have listened as I once did. Time is not a river, it is a garden. And the horloge, our dear clock, is the gardener. Asterisk, do not try to control it. Do not try to solve it. Walk with it. Water its roots. Listen when it sleeps. Ludwig K. Russa asterisk. A hush settled over the room. She ran her fingers gently along the edge of the paper, and for the first time in days, tears welled quietly in her eyes, not from fear or confusion, but from deep understanding. She was not the first. She would not be the last. But she was needed now. In the following nights, Elena kept watch from the tower. She did not interfere. She did not fix. She simply listened. Sometimes she heard the slow settling of the gears. Sometimes the gentle flutter of pigeon wings as they landed on the statues outside. Once she heard laughter echoing in the central chamber, a memory that had found its way to the surface. The 13th hour, she discovered, came not every day, nor even every week. But when it did, it arrived gently like a tide turning at night. It always began the same way. The clock would pause, ever so slightly, between ticks. A breath, And in that pause, something would stir. A letter that had never been posted would appear on a desk. A painting long lost would be seen in a dream. A name forgotten would come to someone in a quiet cafe, leaving them weeping without knowing why. The city didn't notice, not with their eyes, but their hearts did. One night, during a fog so thick it turned the square into a sea of gray velvet, Tomek knocked gently on Elena's attic door. She let him in and poured tea, the room still aglow with candlelight and the steady presence of the memory clock. He watched her quietly for a long time before speaking. "You've changed," he said. She smiled softly. "So has the clock." Then it chose well. They sat in silence for a while. Then Tomek reached into his coat and produced a small bundle wrapped in linen. "This belonged to Lenka," he said. "I found it in the old archives today." Elena unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small diary, the pages full of sketches, flowers, birds, the tower from below, and in the margins, notes in gentle script. Asterisk. "He says I'm like the clock, full of turning things." Asterisk. "I don't understand them, but I feel them." Asterisk. "Maybe that's enough." Elena closed the book, hands trembling. "Do you think," she whispered, "she knew what her brother was doing?" Tomek shook his head. "Maybe not in words, but perhaps in her bones." They said no more that night. Some truths didn't need to be spoken. Late that night, after Tomek had gone and the candles had melted low, Elena stood before the horloge once more. The square was empty. The moon hung low and golden. She placed her hand on the old stone, just beneath the dial, and she listened. Tick, tick, pause. The pause was longer tonight, and in it she heard a voice. Her own, older perhaps decades from now. It said simply, "Don't rush. There is time." The 13th hour had spoken again, and Elena, the newest keeper of the haunted clock of Prague, smiled, because she had begun to understand. Time was not a master. It was a companion. And now it had one more. Spring in Prague arrived like a lullaby, soft, reluctant, and cloaked in fog. Beneath the lingering chill, crocuses bloomed along garden walls, and the square outside the horloge stirred earlier each morning. Elena had settled into her new rhythm as the keeper. She did not speak of it to others, nor write it down. The role did not require recognition. It asked only for presence. And so she gave it. Each evening, as twilight crept across the spires and the bell towers hummed, she walked the same path through the clock's inner chambers, checking the alignment of the memory chimes, feeling the weight of the tuning fork, gently touching the velvet frame of the miniature clock in the attic. But lately, a new question had stirred inside her. She began to feel watched, not by a person, but by something reflective. A presence just beyond the visible world, like catching one's own eye in a mirror unexpectedly, and wondering if the reflection was truly delayed by a fraction of a second. And then the mirror came. It appeared one morning in the old archive room below the Clementinum library, placed atop a cart of unrelated documents. It was wrapped in gray velvet, bound in twine, and carried no label. Elena unwrapped it carefully, half expecting dust or shattered glass. Instead, she revealed an ornate mirror oval with a gilded iron frame. The surface was smooth, but not entirely still. It shimmered faintly, as if the glass held its own breath. At the base of the frame was a symbol she recognized immediately, a tiny carving of the horloge's astrolabe. She brought the mirror back to the tower that afternoon. Tomek, upon seeing it, simply nodded. "I wondered when it would come," he murmured. "You know what it is?" "It's not a mirror," he said. "Not really. It's a question." It placed the mirror in the bell-maker's chamber, between the memory bell and the curved window that overlooked the square. For a time, it remained silent, but Elena watched. And she waited. And on the 7th day, during the quiet stillness of a fog-choked afternoon, The mirror clouded. It was not mist, not glass. It was memory. A face emerged, not Elena's, but familiar. The older woman from her dream. The reflection of herself that had seemed slightly askew, slightly ahead. The woman spoke, but no sound came. Elena leaned in, and the mirror's surface rippled gently. Words appeared written not on the glass, but within her mind. Asterisk, the clock turns forward, but you must walk backward. Elena returned to Ledvig's final journal that night, and this time she read it aloud in the bellmaker's chamber. The room listened. She could feel it in the air, the way it held the syllables, the way the memory bell vibrated faintly as she spoke. Within the last few pages, she found something new. A name. Asterisk, Eliska Martel. Her breath caught. Martel, her family name. The journal entry read, Asterisk, Eliska understood the veil before I ever did. She saw the 13th hour in a dream and followed it into waking life. The clock accepted her, and then she vanished. Asterisk, I sometimes hear her laughter in the chimes, especially when the wind comes from the west. Elena sat back slowly. Her grandmother's name had also been Eliska, and her great-grandmother. She had never considered the repetition. It had felt like tradition, not intention. But perhaps it had always been more. Perhaps the horloge had been whispering down her family line, waiting for one of them to hear it again. That evening, with the mirror still clouded in memory light, Elena did something she had not dared before. She reached toward the glass. Her fingers passed through it, not with resistance, not with cold, but the gentlest invitation. And so she stepped in. The world beyond was not Prague. It was a corridor of light and velvet shadow, lined with clocks that ticked in no rhythm she knew. Some ticked forward, some backward, some in pulses, some were silent. And at the far end stood a woman. Eliska. The resemblance was unmistakable, but her bearing was different. Regal, calm, timeless. You heard the chime, she said. I did. You answered. I became the keeper. Eliska nodded. Then your path is only just beginning. They walked together through the corridor. Eliska explained, her voice a soothing cadence in the quiet dream world. This place is the reflection, the memory of all keepers past. It is not always accessible. It must be invited. Why me? Elena asked. Because memory, like time, seeks echo. You are mine. Elena hesitated. Are you still alive? Eliska's smile was faint. In some ways, I am within the hour, within the breath between ticks. And what am I meant to do? Listen longer. Listen deeper. There are hours even the horloge does not yet understand. You will be the bridge. Elena felt no fear, only calm, as if her entire life had led to this hallway, this mirror, this truth. You will return, Eliska said. And when you do, you'll begin the Keeper's Chronicle. The what? But already the world was fading, and she felt the pull of waking. She awoke at her writing desk, candles still burning, journal open. And though her hand did not remember moving, words had appeared on the page. They read, Asterisk, the 13th hour welcomed me. The mirror showed the past. My name echoes an older one. I am not the first. I will not be the last, but I will listen. Elena stared at the ink, heart still and steady. She did not need to write more. Not yet. Instead, she rose and climbed the tower one more time before dawn. And when the clock chimed its 12 notes clear, true, and golden, she stayed to listen. And in the silence that followed, she heard 13, and smiled because she knew the horloge was listening back. The bells did not ring the next morning. The horloge, which had marked time faithfully for over 6 centuries, sat still in the soft dawn light. The figures above the clock face remained unmoving. The astrolabe gleamed as always in gold and blue, but the gears behind it had quieted. Not broken, just paused. And yet, the city of Prague carried on. Footsteps echoed in the square. A child laughed somewhere down Tenska Street. Life moved forward. But Elena knew the horloge was listening. Its silence wasn't an error. It was an invitation. Inside the tower, Elena sat in the bellmaker's room with a pot of mint tea and her leather-bound notebook. The journal she now kept was no longer a personal record, but something more sacred, a keeper's chronicle. Just as Eliska had described, she had begun with the story of the 13th chime. Then came Lenka's hour. Then the reflection. Each word she wrote didn't feel like hers alone. It was as though she were translating something ancient that had waited patiently to be spoken again. The pen moved slowly, in steady rhythm with her breath. That morning, instead of climbing up into the gear chambers or consulting the obsidian hour map, she simply sat. The horloge had gone quiet. So she would be quiet too. Some hours weren't meant to be observed. Some were meant to be felt. Around midday, a light knock echoed on the spiral stairway leading to the tower's midpoint. It was rare for visitors to find their way there without Tomek guiding them. So when Elena opened the old wooden door, she was surprised to see a woman in a wide cream-colored coat holding a satchel of papers. "Are you Elena Martel?" The woman asked softly, in gently accented English. "I am," Elena replied. "And you are?" "My name is Isidora Greff. I'm a researcher from Lisbon." Elena blinked, then motioned for her to come in. "How did you find me?" "I didn't? The mirror did?" That made Elena pause, and then smile. "Of course it did." Isidora laid out a small collection of parchment scrolls and old correspondence across the bell-maker's workbench. They were yellowed with age. The ink faded to a soft brown. "I came across these while researching local timekeeping traditions in southern Portugal. But one letter stood out. It spoke of a 13th breath of time, and a woman named Eliska Martel." Elena's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the letter. She recognized the hand. It was Eliska's. "Asterisk. If this finds you beyond the known hours," the letter read, "then you too have seen the space between chimes. The breath between decisions. There is a pattern that stretches far beyond Prague. A network of clocks that listen. You are not alone." A warmth spread in Elena's chest. The horloge was not the only one. Isidora stayed for several days. She slept in a small guest chamber above the bellmaker's room, and together with Elena, they began to piece together notes and patterns found within Eliska's writing. Some references hinted at a sunken clock buried beneath the ruins of Alexandria. Another mentioned a clock tower in the mountains of Japan, one that chimes only during eclipses. "These aren't myths," Isidora said one evening, tea steaming between her palms. "They're fragments of something global, perhaps even older than the horloge itself." Elena nodded. "I used to believe the clock was the heart of the mystery, but now I think maybe it's a door." Isidora looked at her. "A door to what?" "To understanding time as something alive." They sat in silence for a long while, not because they had run out of things to say, but because the moment asked them not to speak. On the third night of Isidora's stay, Elena was awoken by a whisper, not a voice, but a shift in pressure, a stillness deeper than sleep. She rose, lit a candle, and descended the stairs to the veil room. The door, hidden once again behind the shimmer of impossible brick, was already open. And inside, the hourglass stood still. No sand fell, no movement stirred. This was the breath between, the state of time when decisions had not yet taken shape, when memory was soft clay and the future still water. She approached the floating book, now open to a blank page. And again, words began to write themselves. Asterisk, do not fear the silence. It is not the absence of time. It is where time listens back. She closed her eyes, feeling the echo in her chest. The horloge was not broken. It was listening to her, to Isidora, to Eliska, to the world, and in its silence it was gathering breath. By the time the horloge resumed its chime softly, one morning before sunrise, Elena had begun a new chapter in the chronicle. Not just a record of hours, but of people. She added names of those who had heard the pause. Ludwig, Krasa, Lenka, Eliska, Tomek, Isadora herself. And she left blank lines beneath, not out of forgetfulness, but in welcome. Others would come. Others would listen. And when the clock paused again, whether in a year or a century, they would understand what the silence meant. Not fear, not error, but invitation. Summer came gently to Prague. The days lengthened, not abruptly, but in slow golden gradient sunset, stretching its fingers further across the rooftops each evening. In the small courtyard behind the horloge tower, ivy crept steadily up the old stone walls. The scent of elderflower and lilac drifted through the cracks in the tower's wooden shutters. Elena had begun tending to a neglected garden behind the tower. She found it by accident, hidden behind an old rusted gate. Inside were the remnants of what once had been a careful, loving space-weathered stepping stones, a dry fountain carved with zodiac signs, and a half-collapsed trellis entwined with withered vines. No one had tended it for decades. So she did. She brought lavender and rosemary, patchouli and mint, the quiet herbs of memory and time. She came every morning with a watering can, her satchel full of books and notes. The city clock ticked on above her. But in the garden, there was no rush. One morning, as she cleared away the leaves beneath the fountain's edge, she found a small tin box wedged into the stonework. It was square, rusted, and sealed shut with time and silence. Back in the bellmaker's chamber, she opened it. Inside were seeds small, dusky gray, each shaped like a curled comma. Nestled atop them lay a folded paper, still legible after all. These years, asterisk, for the keeper of the living hours. Asterisk, asterisk, these are clockmaker's seeds. They grow only when time is kept in kindness. Asterisk. Elena's heart slowed. There were so many secrets still buried beneath Prague's cobbles. So many gentle echoes waiting to bloom again. She returned to the garden and buried each seed carefully, whispering the hours aloud as she planted them colon 1, 2, 3, all the way to 13. And then she waited. By the end of the week, the first sprouts appeared slender, pale green, and trembling in the breeze. Tomek came to visit the garden that day, his steps slower now, but no less steady. He knelt beside the fountain with a faint smile on his weathered face. "I haven't seen these since I was a boy," he said, brushing the leaves with his fingertips. "You knew of them?" "My father grew them," he said, "before he passed. The keys to Ludwig." "What are they?" Elena asked. "They're called time blooms. When they flower, they whisper. Soft voices, layered like echoes. Some say they're the spoken memories of hours gone quiet." Elena looked at the buds, their heads still bowed. "They'll speak when they're ready," Tomek said, "like the clock." And so she listened. Each morning, she'd sit beside them, eyes closed, palms open. Sometimes she thought she heard the faintest hum like lullabies wrapped in wind. A few days later, a new flower opened. Its petals were translucent white, veined with gold. At its center, rather than pollen or seed, lay something unexpected folded. Paper. Elena plucked it gently, opening it on her lap beneath the shade of the climbing ivy. It was another letter. This time, not from Eliska or Ludwig, but from someone else. Asterisk. My name is Eliak K. Rasa. Asterisk, asterisk. I was a gardener of hours, not a builder of clocks. My gift was the soil, not the gear. Asterisk, asterisk. But time listens to many forms. Asterisk. The letter described a long-lost brother of Ludwig I, who had not wished to build, but to cultivate. A silent sibling, whose understanding of time had been more instinctual, less mechanical. "I kept the 13th hour in the roots," he wrote. "It grew in the dark. It does not tick, but it pulses, like a heartbeat, like the breath before speech." Elena pressed her hand to the earth, and she understood. The clock had a garden for a reason. Time was not only kept in stone and metal. It also lived in petals and earth. That evening, as the 13th hour stirred once more, Elena returned to the garden under the light of the moon. The flowers glowed faintly soft luminescence, like paper lanterns floating low to the ground. They did not shimmer with magic, not loudly, but they were listening. She sat between the rows of time blooms and opened the keeper's chronicle, pressing one of the petals gently into the page. As it dried, it curled into the shape of a spiral, like a clock, like a fingerprint dot, and in that spiral, memory stirred. She saw a vision, not sharp, not loud, but soft and slow. A young boy, Eliak, planting seeds beneath a starlit sky. Beside him, Lenka skipping rope inside the tower. Ludwig hunched over his plans, each sibling tending to time in their own way. The next morning, Elena added a new section to the chronicle. Asterisk, not all hours tick. Some grow, some are buried and rise again when the world is ready. Asterisk, asterisk, the garden is alive. It remembers. It forgives. Asterisk, asterisk, we must be gentle with time and patient with silence. Asterisk, she folded the page with care and slipped it into the mirror chamber for Eliska to read if she still walked that corridor beyond the veil. When she returned to the square, tourists were beginning to gather, their eyes lifted toward the familiar procession of figures at the top of the horloge. They took photos, laughed, pointed. None of them noticed the 13th flower blooming quietly behind the tower. But Elena did. And so did the clock. Autumn came quietly. The leaves in Old Town turned golden. The sky softened into pearl gray, and the chill in the air held the promise of stillness. Elena watched the seasons change from the garden each morning, bundled in a thick shawl, the chronicle always near her side. The horloge remained steady. It chimed when it was meant to. Its gears hummed with practiced ease. And every few weeks, though there was no pattern, no schedule, it offered the 13th hour again, slipping it into the cracks of time like a secret between friends. Elena had come to love those moments most because they were not loud, or grand, or even noticeable to the world beyond the tower. But within her, they unfolded like music too soft to be written. Time, she had learned, was not a task. It was a presence. And the horloge, it was resting, not because it had stopped working, but because it trusted her. One evening, a folded piece of vellum appeared on her pillow. It had no name, no seal, no scent. Just a single phrase written in fine, delicate script. Asterisk, you may ask one question. Asterisk, she didn't know who had left it. Perhaps the clock itself. Perhaps Eliska. Perhaps someone she had not yet met. Someone whose hour had not yet come. She sat at her writing desk beneath the flickering candlelight, quill in hand, and stared at the page. Only one question. She thought of asking about her future. Or the origins of the 13th hour. Or whether the clock would someday stop. But in the quiet of her thoughts, a simpler question came forward. She wrote, asterisk, does time want? Asterisk, and then she left the paper on the velvet-covered miniature clock in the attic. The answer did not come immediately. But when it did, it was written in the steam of her morning tea. Asterisk, to be remembered gently. Asterisk, Elena knew her time as the keeper would not last forever. The horloge did not ask for immortality. It asked only for care. And so she began preparing a collection not of instructions, but of stories. Folded letters, short entries, pressed petals. glimpses of what the clock had shown her. She placed them all inside the old, velvet-lined case where Ludwig had once kept his tuning fork. Inside, she added one final message, written with a soft smile. Asterisk, to whoever hears the 13th chime, you are not alone. Asterisk, asterisk, listen. Water the roots, walk slowly, there is no rush. Asterisk, asterisk, and when you feel the silence, don't fear it. It is only time waiting to listen back. Asterisk, she tied the box with silver ribbon and placed it on the topmost shelf of the bellmaker's chamber, where dust would not dare to settle. That night, the city was still. Fog crept along the alleyways, and the rooftops disappeared into cloud. The square outside the horloge was empty, lit only by one flickering lamp beside a vendor's cart left unattended. Inside the tower, Elena sat alone with the mirror. The reflection had been quiet for many days. No Eliska, no corridor, no words. Tonight it shimmered. She looked into it and saw her own face holder, lying gently with time. Not weary, not sad dot, just full dot, the mirror rippled dot. And then, like a soft breeze brushing a wind chime, it whispered her name. Elena. She did not respond. She only smiled. The 13th chime began, one slow golden note, and instead of watching it pass, she stepped into it. The next morning, Thomas entered the tower, humming quietly to himself, a basket of bread in his arms. He called Elena's name, expecting her to be in the garden, or perhaps reading in the bellmaker's room, but she was not. There, the chronicle lay open, a sprig of lavender marking the final page. The miniature clock ticked, its hands still. The velvet-lined box sat waiting dot, and the horloge? It ticked on peacefully, rhythmically, faithfully dot at noon. It chimed 13. Thomas closed his eyes and nodded once. A tear slipping down his cheek dot, the clock had listened dot, and it had said goodbye. Some say Elena simply wandered off into the hills outside Prague dot, others claim they've seen her in reflection passing windows. Quiet ponds, mirrors in still rooms, but the keepers know. She stepped into the breath. Between ticks dot, she became part of the silence that listens. The horloge remains dot, the flowers still bloom in the garden dot, and the 13th hour still stirs from time. To time when the world grows quiet, enough to hear it, when a heart asks a soft question, when a child forgets the difference between minutes and moments. That's when the clock hums, and time remembers to be kind.